What's happening, everybody, and welcome back. So this lecture is on anti-Asian racism and violence in the U.S. And so there's three sections to this lecture. The first part is looking at some definitions and terms that is really the foundation of anti-Asian racism in the U.S. And then we'll look at the rise of violence against Asian communities as a result of a rhetoric around COVID-19. And then lastly, we'll look at the legacy or the history of anti-Asian racism and violence. And let me just say that there's so much in our history that this lecture is unable to cover it all. So if you're interested in this subject, I always encourage that you really do some research. I'll provide obviously some readings and videos in our assigned media section of the module, but if you want to know more than what I'm able to provide you, this is something that is very contemporary, an issue that's contemporary within Asian American communities, and we need more voices to stop Asian hate. So let's get it. So there's a few definitions I want to start us with to really situate us within this conversation of anti-Asian racism and violence. So the first one is this concept of white supremacy. When we talk about white supremacy, right, we're looking at the belief that white people constitute a superior race and should therefore dominate society. So what does that mean? Dominate societies, we're thinking it politically, economically, socially, right? Creating a racial hierarchy where white folks are at the top and people of color are underneath them. Now, why is this relevant to anti-Asian racism? We've already learned some of the exclusionary laws, and it was really situated in creating a white country, or a country that only consists of people of European descent. So when we look at this racism and violence, right, it is situated in this concept or this belief that white people is a superior race than any other group of people. Now, within white supremacy, there's this concept of nativism, right? So it's not just about race, but it's about the intersection of race and citizenship, right? And so when we talk about nativism, we're talking about the policy of protecting the interests of native born or established inhabitants against those of immigrants. Now, we talked about this concept within Asian communities of being perpetually foreign, right? And so if we see Asian folks as immigrants, as being foreigners, right, we automatically want to protect our interests as native born citizens and really remove resources and any type of uh, opportunities from those who are considered quote unquote immigrant. And then the last thing I want to talk about, as far as these three major concepts, is this concept of xenophobia, right? And this is really coupled with situated in the white supremacist ideology that really breeds nativist xenophobia, right? And what xenophobia is: the fear and hatred of strangers or foreigners or anything that is strange or foreign. And so you see this a lot in contemporary rhetoric around immigration, right? And this kind of fear of brown people taking over, right? And so that fear then fuels hatred, which then, guess what, fuels violence. So that's the last thing we're going to look at as far as definition goes. And there's two definitions I really want to talk about. There's different types of violence, right? But the two that I want to talk about that's relevant to this conversation is the one that's physical violence and really verbal or emotional violence. So physical violence is any deliberate use of physical force with the intent to inflict injury, fear, or even aggression in the victim, right? So this can range from cuts and bruises to actual murder. And we'll look at some of these instances a little bit later in the lecture. But it usually begins with small exchanges that escalate into more serious attacks, right? And so when we look at the history portion, what we'll notice is that there's always some sort of rhetoric, some sort of speech around, Asians taking over the land or they're taking jobs, etc. Prior to physical violence, physical force to inflict injury. And then this other is verbal violence, which is an emotional type of violence, right? When someone is using their words to assault, dominate, ridicule, manipulate, and or degrade another person and negatively impact that person's mental and psychological health. Now, in the cartoon, this little cartoon strip, it says, because of the virus, there's a chance that people may say or do mean things to us, right? And that's sort of that verbal violence, right? Go back to China, assuming, and this is said to all type of Asian people, regardless if they're Chinese or not, right? And that in itself is violence, right? Not knowing or stereotyping all Asian people into this one homogeneous group, right? Um, but verbal abuse is another means of controlling and maintaining power over another person. And really, that is situated in that concept of nativism, because when we say things like go back to your country, right, that is that right there tells us that that person is seeing themselves as a native of the land, and that they should dominate and control the land, and that anyone who does not look like this, which is usually people of color, and in this instance, people of Asian descent, needs to go back to the country that they think that they came from, regardless if we were born here or not. So again, white supremacy, nativism, xenophobia, and violence all coupled together, right? And the intersection of these four ideologies is at the root of anti-Asian racism and violence. So now let's look at this contemporary issue of COVID-19. Now, we all know that because COVID-19 originated in China, there's been some rhetoric around blaming Chinese people for bringing, or for, being scapegoated around COVID-19 spreading across the world, right? And so this rhetoric, was begun, right, was said by President Trump when he was president, and after he made his speech and started calling it the Chinese flu, or kung flu or something, whatever he was saying. We'll look at a little clip here in a second. You see that violence against Asian and Asian American communities surged by 150%. 150%. That's crazy. And it's all based on the words and speeches of racist people, of people who are rooted in white supremacy and nativism. So let's just look at this little clip here. This is really when you start to see people associating COVID-19 with people of Asian descent. And it's really because of Trump, right? But this is not the first time that specifically Chinese people were blamed for an outbreak. In 1900, right, there were Chinese immigrants blamed for the bubonic plague, or aka Black Death, only because one of the first people who got it was of Chinese descent, even though they now think that that particular virus came from Australia, right? And so this is something that is not new for people of Asian descent. And this is not the only story, right? There's other stories of, specifically Chinese immigrants being blamed for an outbreak. So the rise of violence, let's talk about Vikar Ratanpakdi. I think I'm saying this guy's name wrong. I know I'm saying it wrong. And I really want to honor what I'm saying. But Vikar was a Thai person of Thai descent. First of all, first and foremost, was not Chinese at all, but was a person of Thai descent who was walking on his daily walk, an elder. I think he was like 89 or 90. He was an elder. And a man came across the street and shoved him for no reason other than blaming Asian people for this pandemic, right? For spreading COVID-19 across the world. And this is the result. He ended up dying a few days later, right? And this is in San Francisco, right? This is where we are. And so this is just one example of thousands of examples. Another one is the shooting that took place in 2021 in Atlanta. As you can see, most of these people are of Asian descent, right? And it was because of the rhetoric around associating Asianness, right? People of Asian descent with COVID-19 and the spreading of COVID-19, and as a result, the pandemic, right? And having to be isolated, right? And so you see that, there used to be this thing, sticks and stones may break your bones, but words will never hurt me. That's the most inaccurate saying I've ever seen, because you see that all this violence all starts with racist rhetoric, right? With racist rhetoric. And so the last part I want to talk about is the history of anti-racism, or excuse me, anti-Asian racism and violence. So we've talked about a lot of these things, in previous modules, specifically around the exclusion of Chinese folks. But I wanted to start this conversation with this quote. From the first immigration of Chinese to this country in the 1850s to the present, you've seen an ebb and flow of such violence. Now, we talked about some of the exclusionary laws, such as the Page Law and the Chinese Exclusion Act, but that was just the beginning, and we're going to go over those again, just so you can see sort of like how violence, right, is not just physical, but there's verbal and emotional and even political violence, right? And so let's take a look at government policies. Now, we talked about People versus Hall, 1854, right? People versus Hall is where the Supreme Court established that Chinese Americans and Chinese immigrants had no right to testify against white citizens, right? And so this right here is one of the earliest laws that marked people of Chinese descent and really people of Asian descent as inferior, because they could not testify along with other communities of color like Black folks and Latinx folks who were already within the language of the policy, showing that they cannot testify against white folks, right? And so now we get this court decision, right? Which solidifies their status as being inferior. Then we get that 1875 Page Act, right, which prohibited the recruitment of laborers from China, Japan, or any Oriental country. That means any country within Asia, right? Any Asian country who were brought to the U.S. not of their own will, or who were brought for lewd and immoral purposes, right? And it specifically targeted women because of the stereotypes that women of Asian descent were only being immigrated, or were only immigrating into the U.S. to work as prostitutes, right? So there's a hypersexualization happening here, and that's violent, right? First of all, prohibiting anyone from coming into the country based on stereotypes or racism, right, is a violent act. And so the Page Act and subsequently the Chinese Exclusion Act, both violent acts, violent policies that the government passed, right, to exclude Chinese folks and really people of Asian descent. Now, as a result of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and I know we've been beating this one into the head, so I'm not going to really talk too much about it, but I want to just highlight this part where it says, although Chinese composed of only 0.002% of the nation's population, right, Congress passed this Exclusion Act to placate workers' demands and assuage concerns about maintaining white racial purity. Remember what I said about the concept of white supremacy and nativism, right? And so you see it in this act again. to placate workers' demands. And we talk about workers' demands, we're talking about white workers. You get the government's, the gentleman's agreement, which was not a legit policy, but it was an informal arrangement between U.S. and Japan. And how did this exclude people of Japanese descent? The government of Japan, right, decided to forbid any type of visas or passports for Japanese laborers so that they can go into the U.S. in exchange for the United States, specifically in San Francisco and the state of California, to release the segregation, because Japanese students, right, people of Japanese descent were segregated just like all other races across the nation from white students, right? And that was a violent act. And so Japan stepped in and said, yo, if you remove this segregation, then we'll make sure that no more Japanese laborers come over, or no more Japanese people come over to the United States, with the exception of folks, families who are already in the US, right? Then you get this 1917 Bar-Zone Act. Now, as another result of the Chinese exclusion, then you start getting more other Asian folks coming over, specifically those of South Asian descent, or what we call Indians here, right, from India. And so because of the influx of these other folks of Asian descent, of course, you get that white supremacist and nativist attitude. Oh no, we have, an invasion of the Hindus, right? These are the rhetoric before violence ensues. Remember, rhetoric comes before violence ensues, and rhetoric can be in the form of speech, in newspaper articles, etc. And so in this image, you see our first invasion by Hindus and Mohammedans, right? But so 1917 Bar-Zone Act then extended this Chinese exclusion to include all types of Asian people, right? It's a barred zone extending from Middle East to Southeast Asia. No one was allowed to enter the US, right? And again, this is rooted in the concept of white supremacy, the right to dominate, which means also dominate the policies that determine who can come in and who can come in and who can't come in, right? So at the bottom it says intended to prevent undesirables from immigrating to the US, right? But it really targeted folks from Asia. And then the last one I want to talk about, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this 1935 Tydings-McDuffie Act. So after we looked and talked about the barred zone, my mind went blank just like that. What this didn't prevent was Filipinos from coming in, because the Philippines was a colony of the U.S., so they had free passage, meaning that they could come and go as they wanted. But again, because of the barred zone, right, eliminating laborers, you see an influx of Filipinos coming onto the mainland. And of course, again, the same rhetoric, they're taking our jobs, you need to do something, etc. Then you get the government really you get the government creating policies aimed at the Philippines' eventual independence, so that they can then exclude them from freely immigrating into the United States. I'm telling you, talk about violence. Talk about violence. So those are just some of the ways the government inflicted violence on people of Asian descent, and it really created this culture of anti-Asian racism and violence. Now let's look at the actual physical violence as a result of these ideologies that we talked about before, which again are white supremacy, nativism, and xenophobia. So we're looking at massacres and riots. So the first one I want to look at is the Chinese massacre in 1871. And so on October 24th, 1871, following the murder of a white man caught in the crossfire between rival Chinese groups. More than 500 white and Hispanic rioters surrounded and attacked LA's small Chinese community known as Negro Alley. And at least 17 Chinese men and boys were lynched. 1871, y'all. They were all hanged across several downtown sites, anywhere the rioters could find a beam and string a noose. And 8 of those rioters were eventually convicted of manslaughter, not murder. But those convictions were even overturned. So no one else was punished. So this was the murder of 17 Chinese men and boys by 500 people, y'all. And nobody was punished. Now, what does this mean? It means that it's setting a precedent that you can kill people of Chinese descent in this case, but really people of Asian descent with no consequence. So if you have no consequence, guess what? You're going to keep on killing people because you don't get a consequence. And that seems very familiar for Black folks today, right? There is some connections here. The next one is Rock Springs Massacre in 1885. This is in Wyoming territory. It was a long-standing aggression against Chinese miners that exploded in September of 1885 when 100 to 150 vigilantes surrounded and attacked Chinese mine workers. They killed about 28 people and burned around 79 homes. A bunch of Chinese folks fled to nearby town, and then they were tricked into boarding a train that they were told that was going to take them to San Francisco, but instead it took them back to Rock Springs, where they were forced back into that mine. Again, nothing happened to these quote-unquote vigilantes, setting a precedence, right? This is the history of anti-Asian racism and violence, right? And I keep saying Asian versus Chinese because, as we know, it doesn't matter what you are. As long as you look like you're a person of Chinese descent, they're going to assume that you're Chinese, right? Because they've lumped all folks of it, specifically East Asian, because not all Asians look alike, right? But specifically East Asian people, they lump together. And you'll see an example of that in a minute. The next one is the Watsonville riots. Now, this happened as a result of Filipino men dancing with white women. Legit. Just because they were dancing with white women. And again, because of white supremacy and whiteness being the supreme, or white folks thinking they're better and that they can dominate every part of society, including white women's bodies, and determine whether or not a person can date a person who is of European descent, right? And so this was a violent riot as a result of Filipinos being seen dancing with white women. As a result of this riot, and not because people were murdered, right? But because Filipino men were dancing with white women after the riot in 1934, right? Because the violence between white people in Watsonville and Filipinos in Watsonville did not cease after this riot. Then you see that there is a West Coast what do I want to say? Ride of policy passing around miscegenation. Miscegenation is interracial marriages. And so these were anti-miscegenation laws, meaning that these were laws to prohibit marriages, specifically between Filipino and white residents. Now, the Filipinos are not the only people, right? Mostly people of color were affected by any type of miscegenation law. They did not want white people intermixing with people of color. Remember, white purity. They're trying to maintain white purity. And then we have the murder of Vincent Chin, 1982. Now, Vincent Chin was a 27-year-old Chinese American who was blamed for taking auto industry jobs. Now, let me just say that they thought that Vincent was Japanese. And at that time, there was a lot of Japanese laborers working in the auto industry. And so white laborers, just like they did with the Chinese folks in the 1800s, and they excluded them through policy, right? Mistakenly identify Vincent as a Japanese person, even though he's Chinese. So this is what I was talking about, lumping all of East Asian folks together, right? Simply because of the way that they look similar, and they don't actually look alike, but whatever, that's neither here nor there. So he was beaten to death because he was identified as a Japanese taking auto industry jobs, right? He ended up dying a few days later as a result of that beaten. He was beaten with a baseball bat, and his assailants did not get charged with murder. They got charged with manslaughter. And manslaughter, the lowest possible sentence you can get is 15 years. And these people got probation. They didn't get years in prison. They got probation and a $3,000 fine. I'm just saying. And we wonder why people are freely inflicting physical harm upon people of Asian descent, upon people of African descent, upon people of Latinx descent, because there's really no consequences for the murders in history. There's very few consequences that folks will receive as a result of murdering a person from one of these groups. And then we have the LA riots of 1992. Now, most times when you talk about the LA riots, you think of Rodney King, right? But what happened right before Rodney King? Because the riots, what you find is that a lot of the storekeepers or the shops that were targeted were owned by people of Korean descent, right? And so, why folks of Korean descent? A lot of people do not talk about the case of Latasha Harlins, which was a 15-year-old girl who went into this Korean liquor store, this Korean owned liquor store owned by this person named Suja Do, who ended up killing Latasha Harlins because she was caught putting OJ, she was stealing out of the store. And when she got caught, she hit the person, hit the storekeeper, and the storekeeper got their gun and shot and killed Latasha. So there was already some animosity between Black folks and Korean folks prior to Rodney King. But then when Rodney King's the police got off for Rodney King, right? That started this riot. And the animosity that was brewing well before Rodney King, right? It came to a head, and the consequence was that a lot of the looters and rioters targeted Korean stores. About 40 to 50% of the property damage during the LA riots was Korean businesses. And so the last one I want to talk about, and again, this is not an exhaustive list, is 9/11. And this image is incorrect and I forgot to change it, but 9/11, 2011, when the Twin Towers came down as a result of planes crashing into it, right? And so, what a lot of people don't know is when we talk about 9/11, we automatically assume that we're talking about people of Middle Eastern descent because we associate Muslims with Middle Eastern people. But again, because of stereotypes and really ignorance of Asian folks, right? We also, a lot of people of South Asian descent were targeted as a result of 9/11, right? One example was 4 days after September 11th, so that would be like September 15th, right? There was an aircraft mechanic, Frank Silva Roque, who murdered a Silk American gas station owner, Babir Singh Sodhi. I hope I'm saying the names right, because Roque mistook him for a Muslim. Again, similar to Japanese, Korean, Chinese, Eastern Asian folks being confused as one and the same as people with, brown skin. They, right? We all look alike apparently. But so even though on the surface it seems like it's not actually targeting a group of people, it depends on who you think those people are and what lack of knowledge you have, right? And so I'm going to end this with the 9/11. Again, not an exhaustive list. I think I keep saying that over because there's just so many examples, right, of different violent history that occurred from the advent or from the immigration of Chinese folks until 2022, the day we are in now, right? And so you see that the government and really regular ass people are inflicting violence and our country has a legacy of violence that really justifies anti-Asian racism,